I will introduce our next speaker. Yeah. Yeah, our next speaker is Dr. Gail Lonergan.
Lonergan, yes.
Yeah, sorry. Dr. Gail Lonergan is a senior lecturer at Ruskin College, Oxford, and has worked at the universities of Warwick, Oxford, London, and the High School of Economics in Russia. Her research interests includes the politics and history of Russia, with a particular focus on the early development of the Bolshevik Party and the formation of the one-party state in the Soviet Union. Her research has covered the development of the Russian Soviet state from Peter the Great to Stalin, and she has worked on projects as diverse as the history of urban registration, permits and surveillance in Moscow to the building of 18th century St. Petersburg as an early modern urban space of state control. Her current research looks at the Bolshevik Party congresses from the 1916 to the 1922 and tracks the changes in party governance, structure, and membership as it is moved from an illegal underground movement to control over revolutionary state. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thanks very much. So as just said, this has come from what I'm actually working on, which is effectively the Bolsheviks keep meeting up in these congresses, 1917, 1916, etc., 1922, and the huge changes that come about. From an underground revolutionary group to suddenly being in charge of the country. And then Clemeno asked me to contribute to this. And I had the recollection in Ilya Ehrenberg's book, First Years of Revolution, which is a rather sometimes quite chatty, very easy to read idea of how the revolution was experienced. And to give you an idea, like I said, I'm going to take you back in time now to 1916-17. And at the time, everything in 1917, when you read about this time, everything seems possible. So they think. Everything seems possible, and so that's why I wanted this quote to be there. It was a great time for projects. Okay? In every institution in Kiev, it seemed, grey-haired eccentrics and young enthusiasts were drafting projects for a heavenly life on earth. So you can imagine in a place like this, everybody would have their own project for how everything could be better. Okay? And that was the period in which I'm looking at. And so I started to think about projects, and I thought, well, maybe I could look at a small project or whatever. And then I thought, actually, no. Why don't we look at the big project? And so that means October 1917. If we're talking about utopias, apocalypse, 1917, it has to be. And realistically, it has to be October. And so what did that mean? That meant taking on Lenin. So Lenin's, and then I thought to myself, well, what's the if we've got utopias, and Lenin's not usually associated with this, but there is one tract that political theorists always have a problem with when it comes to Lenin, and it is his State and Revolution. It's probably one of his most important works, but it's also usually dismissed as a deviation or as some kind of utopian dream world, and most unlike Lenin's own usual genre. When you read most of Lenin's works, you realise it's a bit like sometimes like reading St. Paul. You were talking about religion before, and Lenin quite often reminds me that those eternal things with St. Paul to the Corinthians, St. Paul to the Colossians, and you think, oh, these poor people, I mean, they have to keep listening to this man haranguing them about this and that. And that's kind of what Lenin's oeuvre is. It's partly that. He's always telling people He's always telling them where they're going wrong, who's doing this, who's doing that. He's always answering somebody else who accuses him of being wrong, telling them that, of course, they're wrong. And so this is a lot of Lenin's work. And so State and Revolution, for political theorists, they like to go back to what is to be done. They like to go back to 1901 and let's get back to the concrete Lenin. This State and Revolution nonsense. And then I started thinking about it and thinking, why doesn't it fit? He's always accused of, sort of being very utopian in this. The whole idea is utopian. Marx, of course, is the ultimate utopian in this. And then I started thinking about how when I teach political theory, and you go through, you take them, basically students, you take them straight from Plato to Marx, whatever. And then you sort of realise there is something quite unique about Lenin. And maybe there's something in that uniqueness that you can actually begin to try and fit this in some way. Political theorists, Immanuel Kant is, the most famous, had his regime every single day. What time he ate lunch, what time he went out for a walk, what time he went to bed. Never really went anywhere, pretty much beyond Königsberg. Yet his ideas changed the world, but he never left his desk. Political theorists, you realise, their activity is performed at a desk or in a library. Then they hand it over, you make of it what you want. However, Lenin is, I think, pretty unique in terms that he is not just a theorist. He might be with Trotsky on this as well, but particularly Lenin, he's not just a theorist. He then goes on to do exactly what he's written, which you could say, for a political theorist, is quite a dangerous thing to do, and which he probably found out as he went on. But so then I thought, actually, well then, don't think of it like in terms of a political scientist was trying to fit in all this theory together. Look at it as an historian would do, and then look at where Lenin is, what he's doing. What's happening at the time that he's writing this? Is there something that might then inform that a bit more? So if I tell you a bit of what it's about, in case I'm not too sure about State and Revolution, but effectively what it is, it's a re-evaluation of the classic theory of Marx, of the stages of the dialectic struggle and the eventual victory of the proletariat on the way to the formation of communism. And if you know Marxist theory, Marxist dialectics, this is the whole thing. Constant. The last struggle is with the bourgeoisie, the proletariat win, and then they start the road to building communism through socialism. Now, in State and Revolution, Lenin effectively puts a spin on this. He puts his own spin on it by really focusing upon the dictatorship of the proletariat. And most importantly as well for him, he rounds on Karl Kautsky in it. Kautsky was the head of the Second International and a leading social democrat and one of Lenin's biggest bêtes noires, because he made it clear that he thought Russia was not the place to start this movement. Russia was not the place for the New World. It's not the place to start this process of international revolution. And he makes that clear. However, it's clear at the end of reading State and Revolution, Kautsky is wrong. This is the place to start. So let's go back to where he was then. State and Revolution. It's written, most of the research is actually happening when he's in Finland in 1916. At that time, he's not particularly thinking that anything big is going to happen. Everybody's talking about the war. Should you support your nation state? Should you not? What is this international, etc. He is very much against the idea that you support your own nation state and the bourgeois, the bourgeoisie who are fighting against each other. You should have nothing to do with it. That's his particular concern. But he starts thinking this over. He's in Switzerland. Then next thing you know, February breaks out. He's got to get himself back in. He's got to get himself back into Russia and get back where it all is. So he puts it away for one time. It's left back in Switzerland. He has to get the work back. But then he has to leave Russia again. And he runs off. And as you can see him there, cunningly disguised with a lot of extra, a wig that basically complained about the glue all the time. So there he is disguised as a Finnish peasant. And then while he's there, it now becomes even more relevant. It now becomes even more important that he gets his ideas across. Because the revolution is becoming a serious possibility. But there's a split. There's a split in Russia, and I'm sure most of you know this. The split is many, including many of the Bolsheviks, are actually working with this bourgeois government because they're saying it's not ready. We shouldn't be doing this. We can't do this now. It's not our issue now. We should be helping support the international movement. We should be helping this bourgeois government till we get to the right stage. And so you imagine Lenin is there in hiding in Helsinki. And when you've got the State and Revolution being written, if you read his works, there's at the same time what he's doing is the other thing he's writing is he is writing these haranguing letters to the Central Committee of the Bolshevik Party back in St. Petersburg saying, get on with it already. What are you doing? You can't be hanging around with these people. It is all wrong. It is happening. And you can almost feel his frustration. History is about to bypass us. And so I thought, actually, if you put that, and then if you think, and Clemena and I were talking about this, I think last night, about the importance of the person of Lenin. If you think about, there he is in hiding, and a few months later, if you look below, he's actually sitting there running the place. That's how important this is. And so to put that into context, yes, so I'm going to look at things about the utopian ideas of it. But as I say, it's all about, hang on a minute, he now makes the case that they are now here. So his work is about, it's a proletarian dictatorship, but nobody is listening to him. And as he says, history will not forgive us if we do not assume power now. So this isn't a utopian tract, I would argue, in the classical sense, because this has been the argument that it's Rodney Barfield, most recently my colleague James Ryan, depicted as a utopian way of thinking. Lenin lapses into this. And then another interesting book I was reading recently by Richard Landers in his book Heaven on Earth, he argues that Lenin, etc., Trotsky were just taken up by this common millennial end of the world sort of feeling that pervaded all revolutionary periods. I was thinking, well, yeah, okay, so that's fine. So it is utopian then, but it still doesn't seem like Lenin somehow. There's still something that's swept up in the millennial end of the world fever. It's not really convincing enough depiction of Lenin for me. He is messianic. He is convinced, absolutely convinced of his absolute rightness. But it doesn't quite square with we all know, his very pragmatic and politically astute leadership of this party. So he plans, so he's not just a prophet, is what I'm trying to say. He plans for this revolution to come about, and he will bring it about, and he is here to carry it out. So we go back to the conditions in which he wrote the piece. He's away from the action, but the Bolsheviks have just become the biggest party in the Petrograd Soviet. Trotsky has just been voted in as a chairman. And so let's take the symbolism further. This isn't a utopia. We are now we are now in the apocalypse. This is about to bring about the end of that world, the cleansing of that world, and we move on into the next one. All the portents are there. The secular apocalypse is nigh, and the talk and the chatter of all the surrounding, the religious, the cultural thinkers, is a cold, hard fact for Lenin. This isn't talk. It's the failure of the last gasp of the world order, the provisional government, and it plays out in what, when you actually sit there doing the history of this and you're teaching it to undergraduates, often feels like the longest year in the history of the world. So the Soviets have the power, but the leadership is too scared to take it. It's too scared, too afraid to end the world as they know it. So he's writing to the Central Committee of the Bolsheviks. And Chris Reed describes it as a series of ever more shrill letters. He even starts to consider bypassing them completely. Most people actually never seem to quite realise this, but he talks about, actually, we'll have it here then in Helsinki. I can't wait for you. Or in actual fact, we'll do it in Moscow if you're not going to do it in Petrograd. So his task, hence why he has the whole outline of the revolution and the state, is, and to show Karl Kautsky that he is wrong. He's wrong to argue that history cannot be hurried and that the material conditions might just be right. The apocalypse is here. You can't sit back and ignore it. They are wrong not to overturn the provisional government. So, in that light, if we look back at State and Revolution, we can see that as he retells and reworks Marx's revelation and sees it coming to pass in Russia now. This is the end of the old order and the chance to embark on the first stage of the new society, and you cleanse it of the imperial bourgeois elite. And if only they would see that. And in that sense, I think you can see that State and Revolution for him is not some mad utopian text. It's happening now, and we start it. The other thing obviously there's many things you consider with State and Revolution. I'd go through the whole processes and the various stages. But the other main criticism of State and Revolution has been directed at violence. The violence that would come about as a result of the Civil War. How can he sit there? In State and Revolution, he presents that stage as, yes, it will be some excesses or whatever. As he says here, we are not utopians, which of course is what it is always being accused of with this, and do not in the least deny the possibility and inevitability of excesses on the part of individual persons. So it's an individual. There's nothing we can do about individuals here. Or the need to stop such excesses. In the first place, however, there's no special machine, no special apparatus of suppression is needed for this. This will be done by the armed people themselves, as simply and as readily as any crowd of civilized people. Even in modern society, interferes to put a stop to a scuffle or to prevent a woman from being assaulted. That's simple. Because this is how civilization, his idea is that you get to that stage, once you've got rid of the bourgeois oppressors, there is no class struggle anymore, and you reach the perfection of humanity. So we'll just step in and go, please stop. And that's the way he sees it. And this is the main criticism directed at Lenin and would be basically directed at him throughout these years, the acceptance of violence in the process. He underestimates it. Does he underestimate it? Is he being ingenuous here? So disingenuous here? And it's true, he's very phlegmatic about the prospect of a civil war as he focuses upon the dictatorship of the proletariat. But for him, the violence of the bourgeoisie, as he describes it, differs in essence from the violence of the proletariat. Why is that? It's violence, isn't it? It's just all violence. But the violence of the old order for him, and for anybody who's thinking about this, is that for the bourgeoisie, theirs is an unjustifiable extension of their exploitation of the workers. So it's not comparable with proletarian violence. For the bourgeoisie to be successful, such an undertaking as a systematic suppression of the exploited majority by the exploiting minority calls for the utmost ferocity and savagery in the matter of suppressing it. It calls for seas of blood, through which mankind is actually wading its way in slavery, serfdom, and wage labour. Okay. Oops. However, the sea of blood of the bourgeoisie will not be inflicted by the proletariat. As you can see, they'll stop a small kerfuffle. Please, madam, pick yourself up. So, effectively, they're going to put a stop to just little scuffles and prevent a woman from being assaulted. But the most jarring part of this revelation is when he does this. It's a scuffle. He compares a coming conflict to a scuffle. Because even as he denies any future charges of utopianism, in this section, as we see, he's clearly utopian or misguided. If he imagines, and this is not just the idea that basically you have a civil war and you've got opposing sides and of course they're going to fight. I think there's something more than this. And this was coming from my reading of Robert Gerwarth's book. Where is he there? He wrote a great book on the period from 1917 to 1923. It's not just about Russia, it's about all of Europe, in which he called The Vanquished, or Why the First World War Failed to End. And the reason why this is jarring is that maybe you can sit there and think, well, maybe he genuinely does he believe this? And then I suppose the only thing I could come up with is that due to his exile, his distance from events, he didn't see really the level of, he was unaware of the vengeful and the chaotic aftermath of the First World War. It was visited upon the populations across Europe, not just in Russia, but across Europe, but particularly in Russia. The nastiest was probably in Russia. So the violence enacted in the Civil War wasn't that of individuals. It was the beginning of a centralised apparatus of control. The so-called Cheka was formed in December 1917. That's not just happening. The Cheka, a lot of them were, even if they were, a lot of them being non-party, that was always the way they got out of it. But of course, a lot of them would be demobilised soldiers. A lot of the Bolshevik supporters were demobilised soldiers. The war in the East had been fought on the land in the East. The people had been terrorised, traumatised, even before we get to the Civil War. So the violence wasn't that of individuals, it's the beginning of a centralised apparatus of control. And as Lenin realised on his deathbed, violence had become part of the system for its own sake. That legacy of violence, of trauma, continued on. So there wasn't going to be this utopia suddenly, it was going to have to live. The apocalypse had happened, a new world had come about, but you have to live with the traumas of what's already gone. And it was years of trauma. So this wasn't a part of the dialectic struggle that anybody had actually put into it. This clean break was not going to happen. The violence of the period 1914 onwards didn't suddenly disappear. Lenin's revelation of the people armed was a very distant utopian future. It's going to have to go through generations after generations. And so, as I say, the usually astute and aware political activist seemed blind to the potential of a traumatized population, as he says, a population armed and ready for vengeance. And somebody also who influenced me on this was Lyudmila Novikova, who I worked with at the High School of Economics, and her work on the Arkhangelsk province in northern Russia, where she looked at the terror, whether it was red or white. It wasn't ideological. There wasn't anything pure about it. It was often based on local enmities, poverty, starvation, in a disrupted economy, and panic on ever-changing front lines. And so his utopia of the final utopia in communism, where, yes, there would be conflict and struggle, but from the point of view of the proletariat, they would be able to deal with it because their oppressors had gone. No, in actual fact, the legacy of war, trauma and conflict would continue on into their new utopia. And so the announcement of the Red Terror was only really the beginning. By the end of the Civil War in 1921, they'd executed around 100,000 opponents. We probably never know the actual number because it's always seemed to, you see it in different books, sometimes it's 25,000, sometimes it's 250,000. By the end of the Civil War, approximately 20 million people were dead. Approximately. But again, the numbers always go up and down. But most of those actually weren't killed in battle, or most of those actually died of starvation, typhus and cholera. So, at the end of it, what we see with Lenin's trying to make sense of the state and revolution in terms of just purely political theory, you can only really look at it in terms of what was actually happening on the ground. And so that's what I've attempted to do with this particular piece, is all these theories of utopia and apocalypse. Yes, they're all playing on mindsets. Yes, they're all there in the background. But the reality on the ground is of a very, is much more influential, I suppose, than many of these mindsets. But you'll probably, I'm sure, disagree with me. Thank you very much. And then I'll take any questions.
Thank you so much, Gail. And questions? And comments?
I was just thinking of, in a way, free texts. So if we start with Lenin's text here, and then we move 2 years later to Trotsky's Terrorism and Communism. Yes. And I think that what brings them together is that, in a way, both books start from a criticism of Karol Kautsky. Yeah. And then they go their own way. And there's a lot of Marxist theory and so on. But they're at the same time quite different because of the slightly different time period they were written in. You know, Trotsky wrote his book already after the revolution had happened, in the midst of the Civil War. Mm-hmm. And I think, in a way, it's interesting to see that if you have these utopian elements in Lenin, you don't have them in Trotsky, as you can see from the title itself. He openly acknowledges terrorism. Mm-hmm. He keeps saying over and over again that what makes the Bolsheviks stronger than their opponents, the bourgeoisie, is that they're going to tell the masses the truth. And the truth is, you shed your blood and you will have to kill others. And it's a complete lie to say that there won't be violence and so on. We need terror and things like that. In other words, he's way more explicit than Lenin, and he doesn't think of it as a scuffle. He actually describes it in very apocalyptic terms, violence, and he keeps saying maximum violence, maximum violence. And then I'm thinking of how, because I think that probably Trotsky immediately comes to mind in this context, but then I thought of a third text by Lenin, one of his last essays, How to Climb the Highest Mountain. And I've been thinking about it a lot because I think we're also a bit at the moment when we have to think of how whatever mistakes are made, you go back and you start from the beginning rather than keep going with something that obviously doesn't work. And basically the text is in his late years when he realized, as you said, that violence had become part of the system, that you realize when you're climbing a mountain, you get to the middle and there's no way to reach the top. What do? Hard as it is, disappointing as it is, you go all the way down and you start climbing from the level zero. You start doing it all over again. And I think in a way, what a sway from the beginning, this sort of idea, oh, we'll have a little scuffle, but it will be okay. Going through Trotsky, well, we'll have a lot of violence, but it's only temporary because once communism wins, we won't need violence because there won't be a state in any case. And then you move to Lenin, who comes up with this sort of, slightly, probably hopeful in some way, but also very, in a way, on some level, very tragic text. So I just wonder if you agree that you can see this whole development from 1917 up to 1923-24. You can just read the whole history of the Bolshevik Party through, these three texts.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you. I'd actually even go more. I'd say Trotsky himself was very utopian before. He actually handed the October situation to Lenin by the theory of permanent revolution. So, I mean, for him, it was like, I did it. I mean, Trotsky himself was extremely arrogant. We'll go forward, we're having no worries about this, it'll all be fine, it'll all be done. Come on, hurry up, let's get there. But yes, you're right, but then think about when Trotsky's written that, he's actually been the Commissar for War, he's basically been running the Red Army. He has been there and he has basically organised the troikas, the field marshals on the spot, shoot them. It's that simple. And the idea, and the justification was always for the future purity of the perfect communist. So we will do this now, and we will soil our hands, and we will produce rivers of blood, but we will do it to make sure that we still achieve that. But like you say, yes, I think. It is actually really a sad. I know exactly the one you're talking about with Lenin, those sort of final documents of Lenin, of somebody who realizes how badly wrong it's all gone, and like you say, but he also realizes he's dying, and even that's the classic one. His last will and testament is him trying to reconfigure the makeup of the central committee and who should be there and who shouldn't be there, and who he does want and who he doesn't want. And yes, it's very sad, but they've gone through the most horrendous civil war where they'd actually considered the maddest things, like the collapsing economy that basically meant money wasn't worth anything anymore, and they were congratulating themselves upon getting rid of money. Many things like this. So as you go through it, you see, it's like Lenin's ideas of electrification. On what? Russia didn't have any. They didn't have anything to run anything, and everybody had gone back to the villages anyway. What were they going to electrify exactly? But electrification will mean communism. So a lot of these things, they are utopias. But like I say, what I suppose I wanted to get across was the idea that in 1917 there was a very strong sense that it's here. But like you say, by the end of the Civil War, a very different sense. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much. So, yeah, please.
Yeah, I'm very thankful for the distinction you made in the end between utopia and apocalypse as a mindset, as a way of narrating, as a way of thinking, and what is really happening on the ground, which is, I would say, in another way, a reality of apocalypse for, as you said, 20 million plus minus people, and probably many more who didn't die, but anyway, it was an apocalypse for them. And from the discussion I get, and I absolutely agree, that this mindset in a way produces or at least contributes to what's happening on the ground. My question is to get a little bit more into detail. So you were talking about Lenin, and the workshop is about the avant-garde and their apocalyptic mindset. But the terror on the ground and the shootings and the starvation is not done directly, personally, by Lenin or by the avant-garde, but there are a lot of people in between who fulfilled the commands from the top, who did the shootings and so on. So do you have any idea how far they also shared this mindset, or was it just a way of order and obedience to order? Or did they share this kind of mindset in their immediate action of, let's say, doing civil war?
Yeah. I mean, I would say the answer is yes. It's when you take somebody like Dzerzhinsky, Latsis, they when they're performing this, they are performing it for a purpose, and the purpose is cleansing. And you come across cleansing, and then of course the Chistka becomes quite a deadly thing much later. They're cleansing the party of unruly elements or whatever. The Chakar, which initially was there to stop, what's the word called? To stop the effectively people making the most of the collapsing economy and going and selling this bit over here and whatever. Speculators. So that's what the Chakar set up, and then it turns into this cleansing organ. And Dzerzhinsky, I think in particular, that is very much on his mind. And of course, he doesn't like these extra people who add themselves onto the Chakar, who don't have this absolutely ruthless belief that is the if you want to put it again into these are the avenging angels that come in. They are the angels that come in and effectively they must be above everything, was Dzerzhinsky's idea. And Latsis was the same as well. He also had this idea that you are wiping out the bourgeoisie. There mustn't be anything held back against it.
But my question was a bit, some levels lower, below that people. Let's say the officer in the prison, the soldier who is doing the shooting. My question was aiming at these, let's say, ordinary people.
Oh, well, in that case, yes, if you're going below there, the Chakar, especially in the regions, would be made up of a whole variety of people. And they might try and clean them up and arrest them sometimes or whatever. But the reality, and that's why I say at the end, it was Ludmila Novikova's work in Archangelsk that basically showed you that, in actual fact, on the ground, it's a much dirtier business here. You might have avenging angels, but on the ground, you've got speculators, you've got... I mean, I actually found examples when I was in the archives in Omsk where there was the old party elder, the village elder, as it was under the Tsar. He effectively became, when the whites were there, he became white, and then basically made money on the back of that, stealing horses and whatever. Then when the Reds came in, he basically set up the sort of the local party, whatever, and the next thing you know, he's in the Chakar because it's more beneficial to be in the Chakar. Of course this is happening. And then the whites come back in and he'll be white again. But he gets to stay on top all the time. So yes, of course that's happening. This is a very complex and convoluted civil war. When we're talking about mindset, I suppose we're talking about the leadership, really. Many people there are instances, of course, of lower Chekar who also take on these ideas, particularly people who will be coming out of the military. But in terms of on the ground, and there's whichever way you can actually stay alive. Yeah.
So thank you.
Thank you so
Many
much.
thanks. Thank you all for listening.
Thank you so much. And I will present the last speaker of our today's workshop. This is Klemena Antonova. She works on aspects of art of the icon, Eastern Orthodox theology, and Russian religious philosophy. She is the author of Space, Time, and Presence in the Icon, Seeing the World with the Eyes of God, a revised version of her Dr. Phil thesis at Oxford. Her second book is Visual Thought in Russian Religious Philosophy, Pavel Florensky's Theory of the Icon. And at present, she is working on her third monograph, Icona, the modernist intervention of the Russian icon. In 2021 to 22, Klemena guest curated an exhibition entitled Icons for Our Time, Orthodox Art from Around the World for the Icon Museum in Clinton, Massachusetts, in the United States. Currently, Klemena is the research director of the World in Pieces program at the Institute of Human Sciences in Vienna. During her academic semester, she is a fellow at the Center for Apocalyptic and Post-Apocalyptic Studies at the University of Heidelberg, where her project is entitled The Apocalyptic Project of the Soviet Avant-garde, the Modernist Afterlife of a Premodern Religious Concept. Klemena, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thanks, Tatiana, and thank you all very much for staying on to listen to me. I promise I won't take too long. I just want to present to you one aspect of my project, which will focus on Kazimir Malevich, probably one of the most interesting artists of the avant-garde period. I know you've heard about him. And I'm going to look at what is probably his most famous work, The Black Square. But as you see, I'm not showing any pictures. And there is a reason for that. Actually, this is, there. This is actually partly the idea of what my talk will be about. So basically, I'm going to look at Malevich's texts, which many specialists in the field have become quite interested in that because some of his texts started becoming available only in the last decade. So in a way, it is sort of very tempting to look at your own interpretation or other people's interpretation of Malevich's work against writings by Malevich and actually see, in a way, test your own hypothesis against what he was saying himself about his work. And what I would like to focus on here is one particular topic that comes up in the context of what he says and what his contemporaries say about the Black Square. And I think it is an aspect that has been disregarded, partly because very often, all these figures of the avant-garde, because they make these very extreme radical statements, scholars keep insisting on not taking them literally what they say. And they imagine that they're saying something else, or they're trying to provoke, but actually they don't mean what they're saying, and so on. So in this case, I will suggest that we look at what Malevich says and take him at his word. So what he says is actually what he really means. So what he does is that he keeps describing his painting as an icon, as icona. And what is also quite revealing, I think, at the time, is that a lot of his admirers, a lot of his critics, he had many critics. I think he had a personality that sort of made people angry with him. So he had a lot of enemies. But also I think that because the work he was doing was so radical, it was bound to produce, that sort of reaction. So there were people who were very, very critical of his work, and especially of the Black Square. But still, the whole argument between Malevich and these people goes through the concept of icona. He says he painted an icon, and they say that he painted an icon. Now, he believes it was a great icon. They think it was a horrible idea of an icon. But you have all these people talking and arguing and quarreling about this painting through the concept of an icon. So this is why I think it makes sense to look at the painting as an icon. And let me read to you just some of the reactions. So one of the best known art critics at the time was someone called Alexander Benoit. So when I say at the time, the painting was exhibited in 1915 at what was called the Last Suprematist Exhibition, 0.10. That was the name of the exhibition, and you'll see why last is actually quite important in understanding the project. So Alexander Benoit, after seeing Malevich's painting, says that we have here the new icon of the square. Everything holy and sacred we possessed, everything we loved, everything which was our reason for living has disappeared. To which Malevich, because he had this sort of very antagonistic character, he would always reply quite aggressively to such things. So he immediately went and wrote, I have a single bare and frameless icon of our time, but my happiness in not being like you will give me the strength to go further and further into empty wilderness, for it is only there that true transformation can take place. And basically what I'd like to do is to look specifically at what Malevich means by a transformation. So what is going to happen after painting this icon. And now, as we very conveniently have the screen, I'll start from here. There have been dozens and dozens and hundreds of interpretations of the Black Square. And this always reminds me of, I don't know if you have seen an episode from Columbo. I like watching crime series. It's an American crime series. Younger people probably don't know it. It's from the 70s and 80s. I like rewatching it from time to time. So at one point, there is this episode where Columbo, the detective, in the process of investigating a murder, goes to an art gallery. And he sees these very abstract works, very much like works by Malevich and Rodchenko and people like that. And he's completely astonished because he doesn't understand what they mean. So he keeps asking the woman who is, the curator, he keeps asking her, what does this mean? What is this? What is this? And at one point, he believes he has discovered yet another work, a very abstract artwork. So he says, and what is this? And this woman tells him, well, it's the ventilator. So in other words, I think it shows that nowadays, as the saying goes, that in the past you were talking about art as what is good art and what is bad art. These days, the question is what is art and who decides what is art. So you keep seeing these people who are looking at the Black Square and wonder, what is it? You go to exhibitions, people go look at it very at a close-up view, trying to discover something about it. Now, my idea is that it's nothing beyond what you see. It's just a black rectangle. That is it. And there's a long history of painting black rectangles, squares, in art. There is a recent book by Andrew Spira, which is on Malevich and the black square, and he looks at a long history of representing black squares in art. So even there's nothing original by itself, having the idea of painting a black square. There's nothing very interesting there. What makes, however, the work so transformative and what provoked all these extreme reactions is not what he painted, but where he placed it. Now, we tend to think of, when we talk about icons, we tend to think of sacredness being attached to an object while space is void. And when you put an object in a void space, the space itself gets sanctified. What about thinking about it the opposite way? The space itself is holy, and no matter what you put in it, you sanctify it, and you make a statement. So, where was the painting exhibited in this exhibition in 1915? It was put, unlike all the other paintings, it was put in the corner. And in the Russian context, not just Eastern Orthodox, but Russian Christian context, it is immediately recognizable. It was recognizable to anyone at the time and to anyone now. The corner is the Krasny Ugol, so the beautiful or the red corner. And this is where people in Russian homes would put their most sacred icons. They would be sort of arranged around inside the corner. So when you walk into this exhibition space, the exhibition was in St. Petersburg, you would basically see a painting of a black square, which is placed in the corner. So right away you know that this is what the artist meant. This is an icon. And this is how it was seen by everybody at the time. So I'd like to reconstruct the meaning of icona on the basis of two texts by Malevich, which I think if you put together and read across them, you can actually come up with an interesting interpretation, I think. So one of them is a very well-known text from the 1920s. It was called "God is Not Cast Down." And I wrote recently, well, a few years ago, an article on Malevich's Black Square based only on this text. And I came to a very, very different conclusion to what I'm going to say now, partly because I didn't see the text in connection to this other text by Malevich, which I think puts a completely different spin on the function that he saw for the Black Square. So anyhow, there's this text, God is not cast down. It's very well known. And there's a very unknown text, which is a fragment of a text which was believed to have been lost. Scholars know that in the 20s again, Malevich wrote a text called "We as Utilitarian Perfection." And this essay was lost, and a few years ago, a Russian scholar who's a curator at the Tretyakov Gallery in Moscow discovered just a fragment of this text. So I decided, today, to put the two things together, the two texts together, and to see what comes out of it. So let me go back to the exhibition itself. So 1915. There was a whole room with paintings by Malevich, and there were other futurist painters who also exhibited their works there, and suprematists and so on. So Malevich was there, and he distributed a flyer, a brochure, which had a text written by him, which he apparently believed people should read before looking at his paintings. And in this brochure, he says something that I think is quite revealing about the meaning of these suprematist works, which is, I have transformed myself into the zero of form. Now, it's a very enigmatic statement. And the zero of form is something that Florensky mentions in other writings, and scholars have paid a lot of attention to that. And I think that the initial more obvious way of understanding what the zero of form refers to is obviously the works of art themselves. You know, that you have these completely abstract works that in a way don't have a concrete form. They're as abstract as possible. They don't represent anything. They're no human beings, nothing. So this is in a way obviously the zero of form. But I think if you look at what he really says in the flyer, he doesn't talk about the works. He talks about himself, that he got transformed into the zero of form after painting the black square. So what does that mean? And then I'm going to go here to his text, God is not cast down. I'll read to you just 2 sentences from there. So he says there, the end of a human being is to act no longer as a man, but as God, for he will incarnate himself in him and become perfection. And then further, by freeing himself from the figurative world of objects, so starting to produce art, which is objectless, bezpredmetny, like in Russian. By freeing himself from the figurative world of objects, man will become weightless. That is, man will enter God. Now, all this abstract talk, to anyone who is familiar with Orthodox theology, sounds very, very familiar, because this is another way of describing one of the most important doctrines in Eastern Orthodox theology, which is called theosis, usually translated into English as deification. Now, usually I've noticed with my students, when I mention theology and start explaining dogmas, people start falling asleep. So I'll be very quick here. Don't worry. You know. So basically, the doctrine goes at the heart of this doctrine is the idea that God incarnated himself in Christ so that to make it possible for man to become God. Obviously in a certain sense of the word. What is the end, the aim of theosis? The whole process of human development aims at the unity of man and God. So man and God become one. Now, let us go back to an icon. Icon specialists go and jump from one definition to another. So there are many, many definitions. But something that I think most people working on icons would agree with is that an icon is an image that is used in the process of prayer. When you pray in Eastern Orthodox Christianity, you have a believer praying to the image of Christ, of Saint Peter, or someone else. The point is that you are praying to a holy figure. So how do you pray to a black square? There's nobody there, it is empty. Can you pray to a completely objectless, figureless, faceless painting? And I think you can't, because there's no one that you can address your prayers to. So if Malevich says it is an icon, what exactly does he mean? And when you look at the text that I just quoted to you, and you think of the doctrine of theosis means the unity of man and God, at the point at which man becomes unified with God, there is no one praying to a holy being, and there's no being to accept your prayer because you are one. So subject and object, which is what happens in the process of vision. You look at something, there's an object and there's a viewing subject. When you have a black square which describes the unity of man and God, there's nothing to pray to and there's no one to pray to because you've become one. Now, this looks like a way of using icon in a religious theological sense of the word. But then when you look at this other text, the fragment from We as Utilitarian Perfection, see what he says there. of course, in a non-divine divine kingdom, there is neither God, nor angels, nor saints. There, we are unified, and we are not divided into gods, prophets, and saints. And in that, we is our perfection. So in short, the unity is not between man and God, because there is no God, you know. So God is completely excluded from that. It's a bit like in Fedorov's Common Task. Whatever you're talking about, this sort of sense of unity, it is a unity of we, whoever you think is we, it is human beings, the human beings of the future, you know, the proletariat. Whoever you understand under we, it certainly completely and very explicitly excludes divine agency and divine a role that God plays into all of that. So in this sense, I see icona, Malevich's icon, as, again, a sanctification of, a secularization of religious language. And I see it also as part of his project. If you look at his writings, what he's doing is that he goes from one widely accepted Western aesthetical category, which he dismantles, then moves to another, and then moves to another. His writings are partly a critique of aesthetic genius, artistic genius. There is no artistic genius. He talks about collective creativity rather than individual creativity. Icona is not icon. It is icon in a completely different sense of the word. There's nothing religious about it, and so on and so forth. So I see this all as a project of dismantling and destroying categories of thought that lie at the basis of aesthetics. And I see it as part of this much larger project that the Soviet avant-garde had in the first years after the revolution, of destroying the culture of the past and the way of thinking of building the new world. And I'll just finish with that. Think of this way of thinking about the icon in terms of another text that Malevich wrote, in which he writes that the cities of the future, so once we have communism, the way we're going to build cities is that we will build new cities, and every 10 years we will completely destroy them and rebuild them once again. Why? Because radical originality doesn't accept any models to follow. So you have to start doing everything from zero. Zero is a sort of term that keeps reappearing in these writings, and it means many, many things. But it also obviously means something much more ambitious than a way of thinking about art. It's a way of thinking about the new human being, the new community, the new society, and so on. So there, this is my sort of presentation for today. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Clemena.
Thank you.
Yeah, please.
Do you need the microphone? No, not for myself, but I'm not sure.
Yeah, for recording.
For recording, maybe.
Yeah.
Who wants an? Oh,
Since you want to answer, so
okay.
Okay.
that you want to answer. Thank you so much, the rabbit foot. So thank you so much for your intriguing talk, which I liked very much. Still, I would like to contradict you on in one respect. And in the very same respect, I would like to contradict most works on the Black Square by Malevich, because mostly I got the impression that people write about a reproduction of this painting. Once you see it on the wall, you become aware of the fact that there is texture, brush strokes, canvas, and so on. So what really struck me when I saw it is that it was a very concrete, real thing, which had, which was not just black and not just a square, but something where you really start pondering what is a surface, and because you see something, and it's not just black. And so, for me, all you said, although I find it extremely intriguing, is a little bit off what, in my perception, maybe was the goal of Malevich, or at least to me seems to be the result of this painting, that you really become aware of a surface and so on.
Yeah. Well, you know, I've been thinking about that too. But, you know, I think that the painting is partly creates this impression that there are these interesting things going on there. Now, if you see reproduction in catalogs, you also sometimes get a sense, when it's a really good reproduction, that it shows that you don't have just black paint all over, but, you know, there are sort of cracks and there's something that looks like figures coming from underneath and so on. But, you know, the painting is in a very, very bad state, you know. So a lot of these cracks and changes in the surface can very well be also the result of the painting deteriorating because it wasn't kept in a very good state. You know, my point here is that, you know, I see this a little bit as a thought experiment in the sense that let's take Malevich at his word when he says an icon is an icon. And let's look at the black square in the way he says it is completely objectless. There's nothing there, you know. I do understand that, you know, like with other abstract works, you know, there are people who've painted squares and circles and so on, and they can be other ways of interpreting it. And I understand your argument about texture, but, you know, there are two surviving photographs from the exhibition in 1915. Now, they're black and white photographs. They're not high quality. People weren't professional like Greg. So you know, at the same time, what you do see from these two photographs is just a black square, which in a way looks very different from what we see now because of the changes over time. So I don't know whether what we see now, what is not just what you saw, what I would see too, really reflects the original state of the painting. But also my point is that, you know, I'll compare just two contemporary exhibitions of the black square. I don't know which one you've seen. I saw actually both. There was an exhibition at the Tratikov Gallery in Moscow that included the black square, and they had put the black square a bit like the screen here, you know, and people were looking and wondering. And I think if you put the painting like that, you miss a lot of the original meaning because, you know, the whole corner is not there and so on. And then a few years ago, they had an exhibition at the Tate Modern Gallery in London. We went with Ivona to see it. And the painting there was put in the corner, and basically they had tried to reproduce the original setup of the whole exhibition. So the other paintings, by as many as they could get, by Malevich were there. And you basically, I think if you compare those two, you do understand that the space in which the painting is put is also important, and not just the painting itself. So I'm saying, it's not like I completely disagree with what you're saying, but usually people pay so much more attention to the work itself and so much less attention to the space, partly because of this initial reaction we have that what is sacred? What is sacred is the work, and when you put it somewhere, space gets sanctified. There's a contemporary Russian scholar, Alexei Lidov, that we have worked with Tatiana, and he has come up with quite a useful concept for that. He calls it hierotopy, holy space, sacred space. And I think that my interpretation sort of plays on this idea as well. I want to look at not only the importance of the object, the work itself, but also where it is put in the space that holds it. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. So.
I take it, and I have a question for you.
Well, you can even be quite critical, Tatiana, because Tatiana has actually written quite a bit about Malevich. And as she's also interested in religious and theological ideas, she's been going through this interpretation. And I told her, if you disagree with me, don't be afraid. You can say you disagree with me.
Yeah, so yes, I have another stance, but I will not criticize here because I'm mostly interested in questioning you. And I'm also interested in, connecting your final talk with the previous talks, because previous talks of Ilya and Gail, they, in a sense for me, were about the religious context that have been transformed into the secular means and secularized. I'm really interested in how that going on at that time. My question, maybe I will be talking with Ilya and Gail later. So my question for your talk is why Malevich constantly resurrect the topic of religious means. Yes, so it is, for me, it's kind of all the time through the many years he resurrects the religious topics. He's making them secular, and also he's putting the light on the topics that have been produced by Florensky and Bulgakov and also Fedorov. And as we've seen that Fedorov also could be understood like that. He could be understood as a writer who used the religious context in the means of secularization, but it haven't been completely understood by Marxists, for example, because, I mean, this whole idea of communal life, it is fantastic, and it's very kind of Marxist as well, so they could took that and apply that, but not. And so also, if returning to Malevich, yes, in the 20s, and even in the 30s, when he, beginning of the 30s, when he returned to Ukraine, then he were kind of commuting between St. Petersburg and Kiev, and he was recollecting the ideas of Ukrainian artists like Bohomazov and so on and so forth. So for me, it's a kind of all the time the resurrection of the religious context. My question here would be like this: is it so? What do you think? Yes. So is it maybe an attempt of using? Maybe he's just trying to articulate ideas in the language he knew. So he worked a lot on those, theological works and the works of his circle, and maybe he just applying the language he know to the contemporary topics, or maybe he is just using it as an attempt in order not to be repressed. So he's a kind of, those are very dark times. He have been watched by NKVD and so on and so forth. He was in a jail, and he's just maybe, using, implying that he could be still a religious thinker, but maybe he's implying those ideas in a secular way because he don't want to be repressed. So
okay.
What do you think?
Let me see now, because I think we're sort of running out of time, and I'm trying to formulate a very short question and a very short answer, and I think I do have a short answer. It probably doesn't address everything you say, but I think he wasn't a religious thinker, to start with that. I know you think he was, but I'm just saying that, in my opinion, he wasn't. And I think that not just, I think this is valid not just for Malevich, but for many other artists and poets and so on. I think that their experiences, especially in aesthetics, in art, in ethics, which cannot be conceptualized in any other way but by using religious language. The fact you're using religious language doesn't mean you're using it in a religious way. At the same time, we don't literally have other vocabulary to describe these words. And this is why I think that nowadays in discourses, you constantly see people talking about, politics, for example, and they use religious words. For example, I was reading something about if Putin repents, are we going to forgive him? Like, repent means to say sorry. He'll say sorry. Well, I killed several thousand people. Never mind, sorry, and you continue. But this is not what repentance means. It means you may not say anything when you repent. You just have to start living your life in a completely different way. So it has nothing to do with saying sorry or whatever. So in other words, you keep using religious terms, but you don't need it doesn't necessarily mean that you're using them in their original religious sense. So the fact that Malevich was constantly using religious terminology, which I'm aware, even the very word icon is a theological concept. It still doesn't mean that he was using them in this sort of way, and I think that there's no other way. A lot of his ideas that you just can't conceptualize without resort to religious terminology. So this is my short answer. Yes, Ilya.
Yeah,
Last question.
This is not a question to you. This is a short follow-up to the Tatiana's question. I think that maybe there is another reason why all of these people, not only Malevich, but also this generation of avant-garde revolutionary figures, both artists and politicians as well, use this language. So the one reason, there is some topic, some subject which demands some proper language, and if you talk about something transcendental, you have to use religious or metaphysical languages. But I think that another reason, maybe even more, maybe even deeper, that they try, to appropriate this language in order to, hijack the divine agency as the traditional subject and object of this language, and to obtain this this role, this function of divine figure. So now we hijack this language, and we no need to address to divine figure, and we are the subject of this language, and in the same time we are the object of this language. So in this case, black square works as a mirror in the same time.
Thank you so much. Sorry, I'm not thinking that he is religious. This is an open question for me, but thank you so much. Just.
Thank you very much. I think as research fellow at CAPAS, I want to say that I so appreciate today's seminar very much, and the combination between Slavic studies and apocalyptic and post-apocalyptic studies is just brilliant. And I think that the presentations kind of flow into each other quite well since the very morning. And thanks to your presentation as well, I think the word that comes to me all the time is, apart from apocalypse, because we talk about it all the time at the center, is actually ostranenie, or defamiliarization. Can we say that apocalypse is imbued with ostranenie, or maybe the two of them are actually the same, right? The first presentation or the great homage that you paid to Professor Groys shows you that there's astronomy, because the Western scholarship views avant-garde art as totally separate from, for example, socialist realism. When Andrei Zhdanov said that, writers should be engineer of the human soul. So astronomy here kind of shows you that actually it's connected. And then your presentation shows us that, well, the discrepancy between two translations and your translations is so beautifully done. Also shows astronomy in a certain sense, which is imbued in the concept of the apocalypse, which is the theme of the poems. And then it comes to Shkovsky, and it's so wonderful. I really appreciate how the context of contextualizing Shkovsky and reading through the lens of what people call the hunt for spatial colonization. Fedorov make strange or defamiliarize Shkovsky too. What we see from the Russian formalists, the legacy of it that's played out in. I teach modernist literature, so we talk about defamiliarization in English poems through the Martians, the Martian poem by Craig Raine, The Martian Sends Postcard Home. How it plays out that we didn't even. I would say that most of us who teach literature, we don't actually connect the dots back to Fedorov. So I really appreciate that. And then you talk about Lenin, and how utopia fades or becomes dystopia. Is also. The watershed moment would also be the apocalypse, which is rendered by the violence, by the Cheka, and that is also astronomy in a way, when we talk about this sort of legacy. And then Clemena, and with the black square, is astronomy. It's making strange of artwork and also icon, So I think really appreciate. I think all of the presentations just flow into each other. So my question would be, can we say that there's a connection really? If we go back to what Slavoj Žižek insists in his work, that we need to go back to the root word of the word apocalypse, which is the unveiling. But then for Žižek, it's not the kind of a traditional biblical or kind of ancient term of apocalypse, is in unveiling the truth of God, but the existing truth or inequalities of the world as typical of Žižek. Should we say that that the two things, there's a very strong connection between the two, and as an overriding theme throughout your presentations? I'm not sure if you would like to, if anyone would like to talk about the link between this, as a tribute to Shkovsky as well. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, I never have thought about that in those terms, but now when the way you described it very well, I think that, of course, the idea of the seminar was to bring these papers on completely different topics at first glance that have these sort of common themes, bringing them together. And I think you're quite right. This is one of the, in a way, approaches that runs through, all the papers that were given today, starting from the morning. Astranение. Yes. Yeah. I have to say, I didn't think about it. I'm not going to pretend, this was clear to me from the very beginning. But now that you mention it, I think it is actually one more layer at which you can look at bringing together all these presentations in the same seminar, with the idea that there's certain themes, but also certain approaches and ways of thinking about your material that is very similar and runs across all of them. So, I think so.
Thank you for all the presentations.
Yeah. Thank you very much for... we have... yes, please. Please.
Thank you. My name is Maria. I'm a doctorate student here at Heidelberg. And my comment is much less generalized. It's about your presentation, and it's about, I wanted to support the idea that the place actually matters a lot. especially when it comes to some sacred locations in Russian culture, because even though Russian Orthodox Church is a very conservative one in terms of its traditions, in the very St. Basil Cathedral, which is located on the Red Square in the heart of Russia, there are several chapels, and the ceiling is normally adorned with the depiction of Jesus Christ. However, in St. Basil's Cathedral, the ceiling of one of the chapels is decorated with a mere spiral. So this spiral is actually an abstract image, one of the first abstract images in Russian art, we can say so. But its location tells us that it can be actually the same Jesus, just in this non-figurative form.
Yeah. Oh, thank you very much. This is a great idea, and it really gets to the heart of what, what I've been thinking about. It's still sort of, ongoing project. Exactly that. You have a completely abstract image, but when you put it in a very well-known spot, which everybody can identify as this is where you have Christ the Savior, for example, the abstract image already acquires a different meaning. So yes, well, I never thought about that, but thank you. What was your name? Gloria? Maria, yeah. Yeah, thank you. That's a great idea. Yeah.
Introduction, thank you, Klimena and Heidelberg University for inviting and having me here. So we could sit here, not to stand at the table, yeah? Because it's a bit hard time after the lunch, yeah? Okay, I will start, and you may see the title of my presentation on the screen. So in 1912, Velimir Khlebnikov, one of the leader of future futurism movement, his play, which is called Mir s konca, in one word, the world from the end. Yeah. So in 1912, this play was published. A year later, this idea was picked up by Alexei Kruchonek's futurist manifesto, which called New Paths of the World. The language of the future is death to symbolism, 1913, in which he made the statement, I quote, "We have learned to watch the world from the end. We are pleased with this reverse movement." So I will also use this logic of reversibility, finding a new beginning in the reverse movement, and we'll begin a conversation, a talk about Shkovsky's early manifestos with his late works. All this, research project all started with surprise when suddenly individual but numerous mentions of Fedorov's name in Shkovsky's later text began to line up into a kind of general plot. There is a curious moment that accompanies Shkovsky throughout his life. In order to avert suspicion of anything, he needed to frankly admit it. For example, by telling in Sentimental Journey, this is an autobiographical novel which was published in 1923, so by telling in this novel about his underground anti-Bolshevik activity during the Civil War, Shkovsky avoided the fate of his brothers in arms. Or, having enthusiastically referred to Fedorov dozens of times since the 1960s, even though this figure, I mean the Fedorov figure, was virtually removed from Soviet culture, Shkovsky avoids the reputation of a Russian cosmist, and even raising this question in the literature dedicated to him. Shkovsky needs no introduction, so I will say just a few words about Nikolai Fedorov. Fedorov is one of the most original figures of the Russian 19th century, a philosopher who created a philosophy or teaching that asserts a special form of human domination over nature, based not so much on its technical exploitation as on its total transformation. It's not to say transfiguration. The corpus of his text was published after his death under the title The Philosophy of the Common Task. The most radical idea of this philosophy is victory over death. Fedorov said the goal of the general return of life, the general resurrection of all ancestors, all people who have ever lived. According to Fedorov, every person lives at the expense of the death of his ancestors, lives by displacing them, and this makes each generation guilty of the death of the previous one, makes it criminal in a way. It is precisely universal salvation and immortality that Fedorov considers the only moral and possible solution to the question of this original human sinfulness. The earthly paradise must be achieved by the labor of humanity itself, and not given to it from above. To achieve this common task, the fraternal unity of people and the synthesis of culture must be achieved. There must be a unification at all peoples, all classes, believers and non-believers, a synthesis of science and art, a synthesis of theoretical and practical reasons, true and fair mastery of nature for victory over death. At the beginning of the 1930s, Shkovsky began working on the script for a film about Konstantin Tsiolkovsky, who was not only a pioneer of rocket science and the author of engineering works, but also the author of an integral philosophical utopian doctrine about the exploration of our other planets as the realization of the main task of humanity. In this last incarnation, Tsiolkovsky was a follower of Nikolai Fedorov and his teaching on the need to resurrect the dead. Shkovsky recalls the episode of his visit, real visit to Tsiolkovsky, in his essay with the same title Konstantin Tsiolkovsky, published in 1963, in which the theme of death, the idea of its overcoming, and the dream of space reveals its Fedorovian pretext and is established as a fundamental part of Soviet space exploration project. Turning to the fate of Konstantin Tsiolkovsky, Shkovsky begins a conversation about his hero with the figure of Fedorov and his philosophy of a common task. The resurrection of all dead generations approved by Fedorov inevitably raised the question of the physical accommodation of all those resurrected. Actually, the colonization of other planets was supposed to solve the demographic problem of a lack of natural resources, which was supposed to arise as a result of the resurrection of all previously dead generations. So the dream of space became the answer precisely to this question. Fedorov's mystical philosophy gave impetus to the simultaneously utopian and engineering Tsiolkovsky's thought. Shkovsky does not say this directly, but the logic of his text reveals a utopian, if not mystical, sources behind the Soviet dream of space exploration and its technological solution. Fedorov's utopian delusion turns out to be a necessary part of the dream of space flights realized by the Soviet people. The conquest of space turns out to be the other side of the resurrection of the dead. This is the quotation from this essay. Resurrection is an incredible, impossible thing, and the message of the star traveler was correct. Humanity needs super goals. The need for a dream doesn't manifest it immediately. The dream of star travel after the October Revolution became the common dream of the Soviet people. So this is Shkovsky's word. In a sense, we can say that Fedorov's project is being implemented by the Soviet people, but in the opposite perspective. The goal of Fedorov's teaching was to achieve the resurrection of the dead and the further immortality of all living. To reach this goal, it was necessary to achieve the acquisition of general social and internal unity, which would make it possible to technologically solve the problem of resurrection. In Shkovsky's logic, this unity has, to a large extent, already been reached in the collective community of the Soviet people, who managed to realize another dream of Fedorov, the dream of going beyond the Earth. Speaking about the Soviet space project, Shkovsky in fact makes a Fedorovian gesture of resurrecting the dead, affirming Russian cosmism as the repressed basis of the Soviet space project. Shkovsky, as it were, resurrects the forgotten Fedorov's name, placing his marginalized figure in the center of the Soviet ideological and cultural canon of the period, I mean space project. The old, as Shkovsky repeats again and again, never dies, being a part of a common task. Shkovsky describes one funny scene from the history of his short acquaintance with Tsiolkovsky, whom he came to Kaluga with the Moscow film group. I quote this essay, "Evening, Tsiolkovsky asked me, 'Do you talk to angels?' 'No,' I answered. Tsiolkovsky, judging by the structure of your head, of my head, I could talk. And you?' 'I talk all the time.' This is the answer of Tsiolkovsky. So here you may see the Shkovsky, whose head structure should have allowed him to talk with angels, yes. Okay, humanoid structure of his scalp. And Tsiolkovsky, who constantly talks with angels. But of course, it should be said that he was practically deaf, so this is his hearing aid. Yeah, but through this tube, maybe he got some possibility to communicate with angels also. Amid conversations with angels, the work of entering Soviet space began. The work which Tsiolkovsky did not finish, but passed on to his heirs. Shkovsky's memoirs, starting from the Thaw era, will constantly talk about the resurrection of the past of futurism, insisting that nothing disappears anywhere, finding life not only in the memory of those still alive, but also in the poetic creativity of descendants. An open reflection on the resurrection of Mayakovsky can be found in Shkovsky's late book, The Energy of Delusion, Энергия заблуждения. It is 1981. Let's us remember Mayakovsky. He died. He died very young, but how many times did he resurrect? Resurrecting his poems, experiencing hundreds of reunions in the old world. Mayakovsky dreamed of resurrection. Of course, regular mentions of the idea of resurrection, of course, can be read as just a rhetorical commonplace that does not contradict anything with the official pathos of Soviet discourse. But the presence of a stable layer of Fedorov's references makes us see in this topic connotations that conceptually refer to the project of the common task. Of course, we are not talking about the implementation of the most radical utopian technological project, but about the creation of a specific model of historical movement based on the idea of collective creativity in which development is carried out through the resurrecting reconstruction of old temporal layers and their regeneration in new stages of aggregation. Traces of various techniques of resurrecting the past and resurrecting the dead can be found even earlier in the previous books written by Shkovsky. Was his book The Search for Optimism, поиски оптимизма, 1931, is an attempt to resurrect the recently dead Mayakovsky with the help of experimental graphic montage combining the poet's text and its commentary. Yeah? Shkovsky breaks the page into two parallel parts, 1 and 2, combining the poet's Mayakovsky's text and his own commentary. So in one of which he places Mayakovsky poems, and in the other is commentary tied to the present tense. The purpose of this montage, which overcomes the logic of linearity, is to emphasize the simultaneous coexistence of past and present in a single space of literature, in the single space of, page, yeah? The history of which consists in the coexistence of the different times or different temporal layers. Having influenced many figures of the Russian avant-garde, Vladimir Mayakovsky and Velimir Khlebnikov, Nikolai Zabolotsky, Pavel Filonov, Andrei Platonov, the teachings of Nikolai Fedorov ceased to be mentioned already in the 1930s and were pushed to the margins of the new era along with the utopianism of early revolutionary culture. This displacement of Fedorov's utopian doctrine was all the more inevitable since it used the language of religious or mystical revelation, despite the fact it is rejected its metaphysical foundations. In the 1970s, a definite but not manifested revival of his ideas took place in the neo-soil, neopocheniki, strata of the Soviet intelligentsia, in village prose, in individual esoteric circles, and in the works of some scientists. For example, Alexander Chizhevsky, Soviet biochemical engineer, physics. 5 minutes. Moreover, the open appearance of Fedorov's name in the book of completely mainstream and official author, which Shkovsky became since the 1930s, and especially since the Four era, is even more interesting. This is even more interesting because in his early work, in futuristic years, immersed in an avant-garde context, the name, Fedorov's name is completely absent, explicitly absent. But in light of all that has been said, his early works suddenly begin to sound absolutely different, and even their well-known titles. Russian formalism, which began with the manifesto The Resurrection of the Word, begins to rhyme with Russian cosmism. Of course, my thesis is not to claim that Shkovsky's early texts are an Aesopian paraphrase of Fedorov's ideas about the resurrection of the dead. What is important here is the semantic overtones that arise if, when reading these early works, we take into account the conceptual context of philosophy of the common task. The second volume of which, by the way, was published in the same 1913. And this is just a few months before Shkovsky first spoke at a futurist evening with a presentation which a year later was published as a separate brochure called The Resurrection of the Word. Moreover, in the form of one of the versions of this presentation, this talk, it was called even more radically, Resurrection of Thing. This is another version of his talk, his presentation. Already in the very synopsis of this speech, Shkovsky reproduces Fedorov's logic in of the vicious change of generations, alternately moving towards extinction and death. This is the second volume of the Philosophy of Common Task and the Shkovsky's manifestos, Resurrection of the Word. And this is the synopsis of this talk in 1913, the same year when Fedorov's book was published. So the fate of the work of old artists is the same as the fate of the world itself. They make the journey from poetry to prose, the death of things. The task of futurism is the resurrection of things, the return to man, to human being, or the experience of the world. In the same way, the specific metaphors of this first manifesto of the future Russian formalism take on a new meaning in connection with Fedorov's pretext. And the very first phrase of this Shkovsky's essay, the first phrase was the following: "Now words are dead, and language is like a cemetery. Now the old art is dead." The idea of resurrecting of things determined the futuristic pathos that permeated Shkovsky's first essays and talks. This is a well-known fact. However, the attention of Shkovsky was focused exclusively on the instrument of this resurrection, the poetic word. At the same time, the idea of resurrection being perceived just as an element of specific futurist rhetoric, as a tribute from the young theorist to general avant-garde utopianism and its discursive pathos. However, the possibility of victory over time or the physical limitations of a material world will be the subject of almost all of Shkovsky's book, which never completely disappears, and even on the contrary, increasingly emphasizes its presence. 1 minute. This is precisely about the victory over time, and I'm not sure that I will mention. Maybe. Okay. What does Shkovsky propose as a way to resurrect words buried in the cemetery of modern language? And what is the history of the disease that turned the language into the cemetery of dead words? The logic of the diagnosis that Shkovsky carries out is in many ways similar to that which was the essence of Fedorov's ideas. For Fedorov, the vicious logic of history was that each subsequent generation took the place of the previous one. In fact, death turns out to be the inevitable effect of this replacement. In turn, for Shkovsky, dead words arise as a result of their communicative circulation, when in the process of using them, each subsequent generation increasingly loses the memory of their original meaning. The dying of words is the erasure of their primary etymology, which preserves the memory of the initially direct context between word and thing, as well as between human being and the world. Poetic language, according to Shkovsky, is that common task that is capable of overcoming historical entropy, resurrecting the dead meanings of words, return material tangibility to their sound shell. That is, in essence, resurrecting the materiality of the word, lost in the process of its automation. As example of this defamiliarizing or resurrecting work of poetic language, Shkovsky cites various practices of morphological reconstructions and experiments of futurists who go into the future, returning to the resource of linguistic archaics. In addition, Shkovsky writes about folklore formulas, magical spells, praying of religious sectarians, and other discursive rudiments of the archaic language, which make it possible to reactualize its former unity with the world of human being. So here just some comparison between Shkovsky and Fedorov's idea. And I will jump to the conclusion. This is the last one. In Fedorov, one can find ideas about the crisis of modern art, which is busy producing likeness instead of going about its direct task, resurrecting the lost unity of all generation and the unity of human being and nature. A typologically similar thesis can be found in Shkovsky when he speaks of dead forms of art as forms that do not make it possible to feel the unity of a person, a thing and its perception. I quote him, "And in order to return the feeling of life, to feel things, in order to make a stone stony, there is what is called art." To summarize, I would say once again that what I see as the meaning of exposing this utopian context of Shkovsky's early ideas, which in the future will become more and more explicit. The inclusion of Fedorov's pretext allows us to emphasize the general anthropological, social, political potential of both of futurism and early formalism, and above all, Shkovsky's early ideas. Formalism still has an academic reputation as a strict scholarship that insisted on the autonomy of the literature, the autonomy of art from the psychology of the writer or public ideological struggle, so that as a result, formalism is perceived as another apologetics for the idea of art for art's sake. In fact, the incorporation of formalism both into the futurist movement, which is quite a common gesture, and into the general pre-revolutionary and revolutionary upsurge, the general feeling of exhaustion of the previous cultural paradigm associated with serving bourgeois tastes and the aesthetic design of bourgeois everyday life made their views on art much more radical. The return to human being of the perception of the world was put forward as an extra aesthetic super task of art, which acquired transgressive, performative, and even utopian potential. That's it, yeah.
Thank you so much, Ilya. It was a fascinating topic, and I'm opening the questions and comments.
Right now, or
yeah?
in the... Oh?
Yeah. Yeah.
Can I say something?
Yeah.
I was just thinking while I was listening to your talk, I know a little bit about Fedorov, and one of the questions that has been coming to my mind is that he's very often presented as some sort of religious, mystical thinker. Mm-hmm. At the same time, the way I understand his common task and the way I understand what you just said, it doesn't look like there's any role for God in the common task. The common task involves, in other words, the development of science that makes it possible to collect all these particles of dead people and other beings, because it's not just about people, I guess, and resurrect them. But, there is no agency for God. So to what an extent, what is religious about this thing? In a way I can easily understand, because initially I thought, as he's always presented as a religious thinker, that what the Soviet scientists did later on was basically in a way secularize a religious idea. But now, from your presentation, I was just asking myself, what's religious about this idea? God doesn't intervene in any way. The resurrection is the work of God. He makes it possible, but here the resurrection has nothing to do with a divine intervention.
You're completely right. I think this is completely false reputation of Fedorov's idea, and maybe precisely Russian religious philosophers of the Silver Age and their interpretation of Fedorov's idea through this religious optics was the reason of.
You have to sit there because you are not. Sorry.
Was the reason of this reputation? Indeed, Fedorov uses a language which is very similar to the theological or religious language, because he also talks about revelation, resurrection, and some other world, and so on and so forth. And it looks like John of Patha's ideas in a way. But indeed, there is no divine agency, there is no figure of God in this process of revelation. It is the result of the development not only sciences but also technologies. So this is a real process of human victory over human nature, or over physical nature of the outer world. So Fedorovian project is a technological one. It is about human technology from the very beginning, from the Egyptian time, where they try to overcome death with balming corpse of the dead and put some things in their tomb. So it's also some symbolic technologies for overcoming death. But in the future, he hopes that if every people will unite in the some commonwealth, of not only of nations but of classes, cultures, and so on. So they will learn how to resurrect the dead bodies, to reconstruct the atoms of dead bodies and dead souls into the lost integrity of real life. So, and I think that precisely this religious reputation played a bad joke with Fedorov's the trajectory of Fedorov's interpretation during the Soviet period, because they, early Soviet culture and precisely Soviet culture of the 30s, they got Fedorov's ideas working through the filters of Russian religious philosophers. So Fedorov is a religious one. So we will сбросим его с корабля современности, as well as Pushkina and Tolstoy. So this is the common ground which allows me to put together Fedorov and Shkovsky, because in both cases there are some techniques of resurrection, dead bodies in Fedorov's case, or dead words in Shkovsky's one.
Thank you so much. So, any more questions? Okay.
Well, thank you very much. This is I just want to follow up on this. I still, you said it's the idea is technology is doing that sort of thing. But isn't there some sort of a metaphysical principle here? Or why would you do that? That's what I don't get. Why would you resurrect all people? Isn't there a criterion of selection? And if there's a selection, I mean, isn't there any form of judgment then involved there? And I mean, the colonization of space, yes, but what's the vision? I mean, at some point, I mean, where does it end? I mean, this is also, I mean, is this just the end of history? I mean, the colonization of space. I mean, then you run out of space there too, because I mean, I'm not really sure. I mean, what the sort of the utopian vision is here. Why do you have to resurrect humanity?
Why?
I mean, yeah.
Good question. For Fedorov's optic, we need to do this because he saw the history, yes, as eternal guilty of ever next generation to the previous one, yeah, because okay, we are here because we replaced our ancestors, so we need to stop this vicious movement. Yeah, in a way, this is the end of history from the Hegelian dialectics point of view, as history as negation of some previous stage. Yeah, in this sense, yes, this is the end of history. But maybe we may produce another logic of history, and maybe history just starts from this point. Then every dead generation since Adamic times will resurrect, and we will meet all of our ancestors, and we will in dialogue with them, and after that all next generation will obtain immortality. So there is a lot of interesting thing will start after this resurrection. Yeah. Yeah, for Fedorov, it is completely obvious why we need to resurrect all previous generation. Yeah, because he thinks that we need to stop this movement of history as a movement of eternal negation. Yeah.
Yeah.